Hi there. Let's talk about the Sega Genesis Classic. In April of last year, it was announced at Sega Fest that there was going to be a new retro HDMI plug-and-play console based on the Mega Drive, putatively to compete with what was, at the time, a red-hot retro mini console market. At the same time, it was announced that the Mega Drive Mini, as it was going to be called, was also going to be developed by the mysterious Taiwanese-based company called AtGames, a company that's worked on all of the previous Genesis consoles, such as the awful Sega Genesis Flashback, or the terrible Sega Genesis Ultimate Portable Game Collection, or the utterly horrible Sega Genesis Classic, which came out in 2015. The AtGames-made plug-and-play Sega Genesis consoles are marred by terrible emulation, useless broken controllers, glitches, and tons of deadweight shovelware. And the Sega fan community was and very soon after the announcement, AtGames was scrapped from the project and Sega went dark. Now it's a year later, and Sega has announced at Sega Fest 2019 that not only is the Mega Drive Mini actually really coming out, but that it will be developed by the very well-respected team in the form of M2. On top of that, they provided an actual price, announced the US version called the Sega Genesis Mini, and produced a playable prototype along with 10 games. And it even looks beautiful to boot. If you're a fan of retro gaming, then this is very exciting news. Though it's also odd. The Nintendo Classic transformed the plug-and-play video game market into big business way back when it was launched in late 2016. But AtGames was already making these Sega Genesis clones as early as 2015. And no one really cared. And when people were lining up outside the stores desperately vying for their NES Classic, or scalping them online for hundreds of dollars, all of the retail stores were just stocked full of AtGames Genesis Mini clones. Tons of them, everywhere. There are so many unsold AtGames consoles floating around the market that they were using them as the bricks on the Notre Dame Cathedral renovation project in Paris. And we all know how that turned out. Well, obviously, this discrepancy can be explained away with reference to the vast difference in quality. The NES Classic was a well-made, polished little gem that got tons of positive press. It was a nostalgic powerhouse that millions of people, gamers and non-gamers alike, could relate to. The AtGames consoles, on the other hand, are universally panned, and no one deliberately wants them.
The only people who are buying them are good-intentioned, extremely old ladies
who give them away as gifts to their unsuspecting great-great-grandkids.
I got the new Sonic the Hedgehog, little Billy. Isn't that what the kids like?
But wait, there's more. Retro consoles seemed like hot business in 2016, but then this last year, the PlayStation Classic came out, and that thing tanked, and it tanked hard, leading some to speculate that the retro gaming craze itself may be in the process of winding down completely. I mean, how many of these stupid things can you fit into your TV? Really? You want to find out? You really want to risk making your whole house explode? You want to end up like Notre Dame Cathedral? Also, and this is an important point, Sega not only has a bunch of terrible plug-and-play Genesis consoles already on the market, but they've been releasing good Sega Genesis compilations on all the mainstream gaming consoles for many, many years now. You want to play Sega Genesis games? In 2019, that's like one of the easiest things you can do. They're free on iOS and Android. They're on Steam. The Sega Genesis Classics collection just came out a few months ago on the Switch, with over 50 different games. That's 10 more than the new Mega Drive Classic. And unlike the AtGames set, these are actually pretty good emulations of the originals. And the collection's well curated too. So what gives? Is Sega making the right decision, releasing a 40-game mini plug-and-play console when 1. Interest in the trend seems to be waning, 2. AtGames already did this over and over, and 3. They just released a competent retro compilation that will be in direct competition with their other products. Leave it to Sega to release hardware and games in direct competition with each other. While I'm not convinced that the market for this thing is strong enough to justify the expense of its existence, but I'm still glad that it's coming out, and there are a lot of reasons to suggest that we should all be excited. Here are some interesting facts about the Sega Mega Drive Mini that set it apart. 1. AtGames has been sacked, and the software development company M2 has developed the emulation tools for the project. As I've mentioned, this is good news, because at-game truly sucks. But the news that M2 is on the case is also very interesting. If you don't know, M2 is an acclaimed team of software developers who are responsible for many recent high-quality ports of retro video games onto modern consoles, including the Sega Ages line. Now it should be noted that many people are confusing M2 with AM2. AM2 is a Sega development team most famous for their string of cutting-edge arcade titles, especially in the late 80s and early 90s. M2, on the other hand, is not that team. They are an independent company, and they also do work for other game developers such as Konami. Nonetheless, though they are not officially part of Sega, their work is very high quality, and it is very likely that the emulation quality of this mini console will rival that of the NES and the SNES Classic. Probably. Maybe. I don't know. 2. The console has a price point, and at $80 it looks like it's gunning to perform at least as well as 2017's SNES Classic, which was also $80. And like that console, it's going to include 2 old-school Sega Genesis controllers with USB ports. Apparently the Japanese are getting the 6-button controller, but I'm actually glad we're getting the original 3-button controller instead. I always liked the larger feel of that controller overall, and the 6-button controller was seriously only good for Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat. And yes, I do think this implies we may not be seeing Street Fighter, which is fine, because that was actually much better on the Super Nintendo anyway. Fighting games were really much better on the SNES, in mi opinion. 3. We already know 20 of the games that are coming out on this thing, and while some of them are obligatory standbys like the original Sonic the Hedgehog, there are quite a few eyebrow-raising additions that give credence to the idea that this thing is going to be something truly special. Perhaps most noteworthy is the announcement of Castlevania Bloodlines, a late Genesis masterpiece made by Konami that not a lot of people talk about, and it's a game that's never been featured in any Sega compilation that I'm aware of, regardless of the fact that it now fetches a high price on the collector's market. It's real evidence that whoever is curating the games for this thing is very knowledgeable and very serious about giving the fans something special. Further proof of this is the inclusion of the classic Toe Jam and Earl, which just got a sort of reboot on the Nintendo Switch. It was a fairly well-known 2-player game in its time, but the preservation of its legacy has always resided with true Sega fans, and that seems to be what we have developing here. It's a plug-and-play for the ultra die-hard fans. But even more astonishing than all of this is the recent announcement that both Mickey's Castle of Illusion and Mickey's World of Illusion are going to be included. More than any other radical choice that's been made, these are the ones that surprise me the most, because 1, they're not typical cliché Genesis games, even if they are among the very best, and 2, they are licensed games. They are Disney games, and the fact that they are going to these lengths means just about anything is possible here. Could the legendary Aladdin game be coming to the Sega Genesis Mini? 4. Yuzo Koshiro is going to be doing the menu select music. Wow. Yuzo Koshiro in the Sega Genesis days was a veritable giant. He's actually my pick for the greatest video game composer of all time, for the work he did in games like Revenge of Shinobi, The Streets of Rage. But he's also the founder of a fantastic development company called Ancient, that essentially consisted of himself and his family. They were responsible for such Sega classics like Beyond Oasis and Streets of Rage 2, which I regard as one of the greatest games ever made, and which will also be included on the Sega Genesis Mini. Once again, the fact that Yuzo Koshiro has been brought on board shows that Sega is committed to creating something extremely special. Special for the old freaks like me, who know and care about a guy named Yuzo Koshiro, who used to make chiptunes for video games. So the Sega Mega Drive Mini, and therefore the Sega Genesis Mini, is looking like it's going to be something truly special, even if I'm not sure that most people are going to take notice. But perhaps Sega anticipates this. Perhaps this is the collector's item for the fanatical. Here is the full list of games for the US that we know of so far. Unreal, what a list, but what else could be coming out on here? What won't be coming out on here? Well, given the fact that the console won't include the 6-button controller, I don't think we can expect Street Fighter II from Capcom. But that doesn't mean Capcom won't be participating. I expect to see number 21, Ghouls and Ghosts announced as well, And not just ghouls and ghosts, but what about the underrated two-player Chicky Chicky Boys? Slam! Let's go ahead and predict that one. The one I really hope they bring out is the Genesis's excellent port of Strider. Boy, this thing has a lot of platformers. But Konami is also involved in this in a big way, and I also think that means we can expect to see 24 Rocket Knight Adventures. They've already just announced Contra Hardcore, which is actually much better than the SNES Contra in my opinion, but the classic game I really want to see from Konami on the Sega Genesis Mini is 25 Zombies Ate My Neighbors. They're aiming to do legendary things with this thing, and Zombies Ate My Neighbors is as legendary as they come. I'm also really glad to see Technosoft come on board. They were a key part of the Genesis's early lineup and one of my favorite developers on the system, but sadly they've been overlooked in recent compilations. The excellent side-scrolling shooter Thunder Force 3 has already been announced, but I'm willing to bet they will also include the incredible Herzog Zwei, since it's a perfect two-player game, and two-player games seem to be what this thing is all about. If you don't know, Herzog Zwei is the granddaddy of all real-time strategy games, and the most fun that two people can simultaneously have on the system. It's my favorite Genesis game, and number one on my wish list. But what about RPGs? It has to have 27 Phantasy Star 4, which I still think is better than Final Fantasy VI. We're already getting the cult favorite Landstalker again, and of course Shining Force is on there, but I'm willing to bet that Sega is going to include the classic Sword of Vermilion one more time, since they're adding Rent-A-Hero to the Japanese version, and Sword of Vermilion is actually built upon the exact same engine. They're almost cousins. Also, since Yuzo Koshiro is doing original music for the menu screens, and since we know the incredible Streets of Rage 2 is included, I think it's almost certain that Beyond Oasis will be included, since he did that game as well. But what about the fighting games? I'm not so sure. The only fighting game I can think of that would be okay with a 3-button controller is the iffy Genesis port of Virtual Fighter. Not really the best choice. I don't think they'll include it. Otherwise, Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, even Sega's own Eternal Champions all utilize the 6-button controller. I really don't think this thing is going to include fighting games, or that it should, which is a shame since fighting games were possibly the most popular genre at the time of the Genesis's actual commercial circulation. If they do anything, then it will be to include 30 Street Fighter 2, which is technically playable with the 3-button controllers, but it's kind of a bummer at the same time. So let's just call it. They're including Street Fighter 2, simplified controls and all. Earlier I asked whether or not Aladdin will be coming to the Sega Genesis Mini. Given the radical hardcore nature of this mini console and the fact that both Castle of Illusion and World of Illusion are being included, I think it's safe to say yes. It's probably one of the most critically acclaimed Sega Genesis games of all time. I'm calling it. Number 31, Disney's Aladdin will be on the console. But there's still a few key Sega licenses not accounted for as well. I think 32, The Revenge of Shinobi is a given. It's one of the best games on the system. And so is number 33, Golden Axe. But since Konami is on board, and since this thing has already proven that it's going to be nuts, I'm going to go out on a limb and say number 34, Ninja Turtles, The Hyperstone Heist, will also be included. It's a perfect 2-player game, and every bit as good as the Turtles in Time for the Super Nintendo that gets so much hype in the retro gaming press. That leaves 6 possible slots left open. I think we might see number 35, Musha by Compile, because it's such a sought-after treasure. Also, this is nuts, but EA was a huge part of the Genesis lineup, so I think we might see number 36, Road Rash, and number 37, Desert Strike. Also, since we have Landstalker and Shining Force, I think we're likely to see the acclaimed number 38, Shining Force 2. And for nostalgia reasons, personally, I'd love at least one sports title. Number 39, NBA Jam, You're the One. That leaves one last game for my predictions. I'm going to go ahead and say that Sonic 3 is actually going to be included, and that the moratorium on Sonic 3 will finally come to an end. So what are your predictions? What are the games you want to see the most? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching.